want to talk to you about sourdough discard recipes and when you will find yourself in need of a sourdough discard recipe when it comes to maintaining a sourdough starter. So one of the reasons that a lot of people are hesitant about starting a sourdough starter is they are afraid of the waste. So especially right now when there are a lot of shortages going on, and with the economy and inflation, nobody wants to waste food. I don't even care about the inflation. I've never wanted to waste food. And so I can understand that if you think just from looking at a sourdough starter recipe that in order to maintain one, there's going to be a lot of throwing away of flour and water, you're hesitant to do it. That couldn't be further from the truth. I've actually never discarded any sourdough starter at all, except for in the very beginning, over a decade ago, whenever I started my starter. So first, let me dive into some of my very favorite ways to use up sourdough discard. And then at the end of this video, I'm going to explain to you more about why this would be necessary to create recipes like this, which you will want to have more sourdough discard when you're done with this video, simply because a lot of these recipes are so great to have on hand for a quick breakfast or lunch or dinner. And so let's dive into some of the recipes first. I have my sourdough starter here. I just pulled it out of the refrigerator. I don't remember the last time I fed this, but I want to make pizzas for my kids today for lunch. We're heading out to go to the peach orchard, and so we need to have something very easy. So if I get these crusts made up, when we get home, we can just add some toppings and cheese and be ready to go. So this starter, as you can see, it is not bubbly. It's not very active. There's a little bit of liquid here on top. This is all a fine situation to make pizza crust with. You can make these pizza crusts with freshly fed sourdough starter, but because there's no rising involved, it isn't necessary. I have some skillets preheating. The main reason this is the first one on my list when talking about sourdough discard recipes is because it uses up a lot. So if you fed your starter, maybe you had a lot of starter when you needed to feed it, and so you had to feed it a whole lot more flour, which I'll talk about again at the end. You're gonna need a way to reduce it down before feeding it again, so you don't have to feed it, a ridiculous amount. This is the fastest way to use up a lot of starter, because for each pizza crust in about what is this, like a 10-inch pan maybe, you use about a cup of starter. Now you'll see, if your skillet is so seasoned, which mine is, right away the pizza crust is going to start pulling away from the outside edges. I usually just run the starter up the sides to almost like glue it back down. And then whenever it's fully baked, it'll just pop right out, which I love because I'll make a bunch of these and then just put them on a sheet pan, and then I can make a lot of pizzas at one time. You don't really want it thick, so sometimes if you put on too much, what I'll do, instead of pouring it back into my sourdough jar, which I wouldn't want to put hot starter, that's, this is obviously very hot, into my jar because that could kill the good bacteria in there. I usually, if I add too much, I will just throw it into the next one. So right away it'll kind of stick, but here I can get some of this excess off and into my next crust. So it doesn't use quite a cup, but it uses a lot. For a pizza night, if you have a family, I don't have a family my size, but if you have a large family, you will end up using cups of starter this way. So I'm just gonna do the exact same thing on the next one, running it up the sides, and then I'm gonna drizzle both with olive oil, maybe add a little bit of herbes de Provence, salt, pepper, and then I'm gonna do a third one because we use at least 4 pizza crusts in one sitting. So perfect for a quick, easy meal for a large family. I want to take a quick break from talking about sourdough discard and some of the best sourdough discard recipes to tell you about today's video sponsor, Thrive Market. If you follow along with my channel, you have heard about Thrive Market, I'm sure of it. I have been a Thrive Market customer for probably 6 or 7 years now, long before they sponsored this channel. Thrive Market is a subscription-based online natural organic grocery store. So you can either pay monthly to have access to Thrive Market prices and shipping, or you can pay by the year. So you save a little bit by doing it by the year. I love using Thrive Market for a lot of things that I can't find locally for a good price. So there's some things I can get locally, but they're at a health food store, and so they're a lot pricier. And then some things I can't find at all. So for example, my einkorn all-purpose flour from Jovial, einkorn pasta, Jovial tomatoes, I love all of that. I also love the Thrive Market spices. They come in little, like almost like Ziploc bags, that I can put them into my spice jars. I love their everything, bagel seasoning, their taco seasoning. I also love to get oils like coconut oil, avocado oil on Thrive Market, as well as my favorite granola, which I found out about a while ago. It has all very clean ingredients, so it's nice to have on hand for a morning where we just want to have a really quick cereal breakfast with our raw milk. Love to stock up on that. I love that on the Thrive Market website, you can sort by your dietary preference. So if you are vegan, gluten-free, dairy-free, you can choose to only see options that suit your dietary preferences. I personally love the Thrive Market brand for things like pasta sauce and spaghetti. They have a lot of different items that are almost like the grocery store brand, so they are less expensive, which I love. Thrive Market is offering my viewers 30% off your first order plus a free gift worth up to $50 by using the link thrivemarket.com/farmhouse-on-boone. You will also find it in the description box below. All right, the next thing I want to show you is sourdough crepes. Again, something like crepes that doesn't have to rise. You're not relying on active sourdough starters with the yeast very active and alive to rise something in this recipe. So that's why it's a good candidate for sourdough discard. Now this has been sitting out for a few hours, but it's the same sourdough starter that I used earlier that I pulled directly out of the fridge. It can come right out of the fridge for this recipe. It is starting to bubble a little bit more now that it's sitting at room temperature, but I haven't fed it. Now you might be starting to get a little bit nervous because there's very little left, but I am going to show you after I make a few of these recipes how you can revive a starter that is starting to lose its oomph. That's just seeming a little bit lazy, not bubbly. This is how you do it. You reduce it way, way down and then feed it fresh. So to a cup of starter, I'm going to add about 8 eggs. This is also a good recipe for whenever you have abundance of eggs, which we have all summer long. And 3/4 of a cup of milk. Quarter teaspoon of salt. And then usually I add some butter. You can also do coconut oil. You can also just omit it and then just cook the crepes in a little oil, which is what I'm gonna do today, because I'm all out of butter actually. Now right now it is not breakfast time because it's actually the afternoon. I'm gonna bulk this up to make this a meal. In order to do that, I'm going to make a whipped cream and cream cheese filling for this. After it's been out of the fridge a while, it is a little bit bubbly, but I have very little left in this jar. And this is how I like to get my starter before feeding it. So basically with sourdough starter, to keep it really active, you want to feed it at least as much as what's already in there. So if your jar is this full, you're going to need to fill it all the way up, and then it'll be bubbling over with flour and water in order to keep that amount of yeast happy. So essentially, remember that what is happening in here are living bacteria and yeast that all need to be fed. So in order to keep them happy, they have to have enough food. So a lot of times if your starter is starting to be really sluggish, it's because it doesn't have enough food. And so by doing some discard recipes and reducing it down, that will give you the opportunity to feed it appropriate amount. And I also get asked a lot, how do you build your starter back up to such a large amount? Once your starter is mature, you don't have to build it back up. So right now, if I want a whole bunch of starter, because say tomorrow morning, I want to make 2 loaves of bread, some bagels, a couple of sourdough pizza crusts, pancakes, I want a nice active starter for that, I can just simply feed it a whole bunch of flour and water, and by tomorrow it'll all be bubbly starters. I'm gonna go ahead and feed it before sharing with you the rest of my favorite discard recipes. I'm using this to scoop, but not to measure. I'm just eyeballing it, thinking about how much starter I want on hand. Now know that if you aren't going to be using all of this active starter, you will have to, again, either discard or reduce it down somehow, so that way you can keep these happy by giving them plenty of food. All right, this is what I got here. Now this is of course gonna bubble up and will reach almost the top of here whenever it's at its peak. And remember how little it started with, so how few yeasts are feeding on this. This is what I find really makes a starter happy. A mature starter, the more food, the better. So I've never had a situation where I've fed like a small amount of starter too much. That's never happened. It only just revives it and makes it happier if for a little while it's been underfed. The next best recipe to reduce your starter down, to use sourdough discard, is sourdough crackers. This is made a lot like the pizza crust in that you take some sourdough starter, you spread it out really thin, add seasonings and salt. Really, the thinner, the better. The recipe on my blog calls for a cup of sourdough discard, 3/4 of a cup of flour, a 1/4 cup of butter, a tablespoon of dried herbs and salt. You mix that together, spread it out really, really thin and bake it. But if you're looking for an even simpler recipe, you can also just spread out on parchment paper some sourdough discard, add some olive oil, salt, seasonings. We make this by accident quite often when we're making our pizza crust. Whenever maybe like a little bit of it breaks off the top, the kids eat it like crackers. You can do the same thing with making a sourdough flatbread. So instead of turning the discard into a pizza crust, you can preheat a stone or a cast iron skillet, spread out sourdough discard, add olive oil, herbs, and salt, and then instead of adding on the sauce and the cheese, you can just cut it up and use it as flatbread. So you can maybe put it on a charcuterie board or serve it with some spreadable cheese. A really great base for a lot of different summer vegetables, toppings. It's so simple because it's not even really a recipe. It's essentially just spreading the starter out. Now, to make it more of the flatbread texture, I do find that it's better to make it a little bit thicker than you do with the pizza crust, which I try to make paper thin, and the cracker. Another great sourdough discard recipe is a peach, blackberry, strawberry. You insert whatever fruit you want cobbler. So essentially you mix up flour, starter, milk, butter, sugar, baking soda, baking powder, salt, and then add it on top of sweetened fruit. and bake it, and it turns into the most wonderful little cobbler. You can long ferment it by adding the flour, starter, milk, and butter the night before and letting that long ferment, or you can just make it right away. Again, I will be leaving links to all of these recipes in the description box below. They are on farmhouseonmoon.com. If you go to farmhouseonmoon.com and search discard recipes, I have 30 discard recipes all in one blog post, so you can check it out, but I am mentioning my favorites here. One of the most common ways that we use sourdough discard in this house is with pancakes and waffles. For this, I essentially use the same recipe. I do have slightly different recipes on the blog because I find that waffles do a little bit better when they're crispier, so I add a little bit more oil. But for a basic recipe, I just do 2 cups of sourdough discard. You can use fed sourdough starter. You can use discard that's been in the fridge for over a week. Either way, it tastes really delicious. So 2 cups of sourdough starter, 2 eggs, 1/4 cup of coconut oil, 2 tablespoons honey, 1/2 teaspoon of salt, and a teaspoon of baking soda. We make this all the time. And between that for waffles and pancakes and pizza crust, I enjoy keeping a lot of sourdough starter on hand. Now, another variation on the sourdough waffles is sourdough cheddar waffles. So you essentially make the same batter as you do for the pancakes and the waffles, but omit the honey and add in cheddar cheese. This is a great way to use up tons of sourdough discard because you don't really need it to rise or adding baking soda, and it takes up quite a bit, and you can use it as a very fast, no weight sandwich vessel. So we like to put bacon and tomatoes, sort of like a BLT, or even a deli meat sandwich with some homemade mayo. Really delicious and a practical way to reduce your starter down before feeding it again. All right, the next one I want to share with you is a sourdough skillet. Essentially what this is any combination of meat and vegetables that you want to put in a cast iron skillet, and then you top it with a sourdough mixture. So you essentially mix up some sourdough discard, some eggs, butter, herbs, salt, spread it on top, bake it a little bit, add a little cheese, and it sort of creates this bread layer on top so that you're not just eating like meat and vegetables, there's a bread component, and it's a really great way to use up sourdough discard. It's a wonderful one-pot meal. Along those same lines, I have a recipe on the blog called sourdough apple pie. Basically, it's a sweet version of a sourdough skillet. So you can put apples in the bottom, you can put peaches in the bottom, blackberries, whatever you want. You create a sweet mixture of sourdough discard and eggs, and then put it on top and then bake it. And it's just a really easy, fast way to use it up. Again, all links in the description box below for the exact recipes on the blog. You will hardly ever find me with less than this whole jar, at least halfway full of sourdough starter. So that way I always have fermented grains on hand without any forethought to make a lot of these recipes. So if this sits out here at room temperature, which it will, for the next 8 hours, after that I can now make so many different things that the grains are already fermented. Normally whenever you soak grains, you ferment them, you have to think ahead, but by keeping this on hand, it's already ready to go without any forethought. And then in order to make breads that I'm gonna need a lot of those yeast, I can just reduce this down and get it freshly fed. Now alternatively, if you want to keep a lot of starter on hand, but you also want just a little bit of fresh starter in order to make something like bread or bagels where you want them to rise, you can just take a cup out, add it to a separate jar, and feed it and have that ready to go. And then put this back in for your discard recipes. I do that on occasion whenever, say I have a lot of discard and I want to just have a little portion, maybe a cup of very active starter. I'll take a cup out, feed it, put this back in the fridge, and then I'm ready to go for my recipes that require a lot of lift. All right, well, I hope that this cleared up why you would find the need for sourdough discard, but why you also never want to throw it away. Make sure to check out in the description box below the 30+ discard recipes that I have over on the Farmhouse on Moon blog so that you can never throw away sourdough starter and enjoy your starter for years to come, like I have here in our kitchen. Over a decade of using this to make so many different things. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you are brand new to my channel, please hit that subscribe button. I make 2 new videos every week on food from scratch, natural living, and a handmade home. Thank you so much for stopping by our farmhouse.